Knowledge is power, and those who choose to remain blissfully ignorant will forever be at the mercy of those who don't. This is a show about truth, a show that provides the facts in a world full of fake news. It's time you got the real story. Join me as we unravel the news. Welcome to Spin Game. Hi, welcome to Spin Game. My name is Tony Olson. I'm your host. For those of you who don't know me, I am a writer, author, mostly political, poet, lyricist, and I write across all ends of the spectrum from satire to serious. Today's show is going to be very serious. Today, we're going to talk about climate change. Some of you know me from my book Spin Game, Exposing Political Lies and Tactics. One of the issues I talk about in that book is the misinformation which has surrounded the subject of global warming and climate change for decades. In my book, I expose numerous lies, misrepresentations, omissions, and even some scandals with regard to climate science reporting. We have been taping portions of this show over the last few months, and as you will see, I do a pretty thorough job of exposing the media and the climate alarmists for either not giving the complete story or giving a complete fabrication. Last week, the U.S. Global Change Research Program issued its fourth National Climate Assessment. I've read it, folks, and it's garbage. A fictional masterpiece, but it's garbage. First of all, it's the same misinformation that they've been throwing at us for decades. Secondly, they're using basically the same sources that they've used for decades that have been proven to be inaccurate or completely false. They're using IPCC reports, and let's clarify, the IPCC is not a scientific body, it's a political body. And secondly, every report that the IPCC has done that has tried to promote the theory of man-made global warming has been debunked. They're also citing people like Michael Mann, who, if you remember Michael Mann, he was the key figure in the hockey stick temperature graph scandal a number of years back. And then probably the most disturbing thing that I got from this report was that the bulk of this report is based on data obtained from climate models. And there has yet to be, out of the thousands of climate models that the alarmists have tried to provide us with over the years, not a single one has been accurate. All the figures in those climate models have been manipulated to get the results that they want. And as such, like I say, absolutely not one of them out of the thousands has been right yet. Now, they're trying to double down on the scare tactics. Why? Probably because we have people in the current administration who don't buy this junk science. And these agencies are trying to put us into full panic mode to try and justify their existence. They're on the edge. This is desperation. Why else would people like the IPCC, who just a few years ago stated that they weren't sure about man's impact at all on global warming or climate change, now all of a sudden make the statement that man is the dominant cause of climate change? That's what desperation looks like. Just think about that one assertion, that man is the dominant cause of climate change. If climate change is based on the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as they claim, and man's only responsible for 3% of the carbon in the atmosphere, then how can man be the dominant cause? How can man have more than a 3% stake in anything that happens with regard to climate change or global warming or any of that? The bottom line is he doesn't. He's insignificant. But that's desperation. So with that being said, let's continue with a show that's not desperate. I've put together some stuff that I think you'll enjoy. So without further ado, here's the rest of the show. Irresponsible journalists and politicians have been lying to us for decades. In the 1970s, we were warned of impending catastrophic global cooling, the dawn of a new ice age. When it became obvious that catastrophic global cooling was never going to happen, the narrative switched to impending catastrophic global warming. And as global warming predictions continue to fail, the narrative has again changed to reflect an increase in extreme, abnormally severe weather occurrences. So let's talk about just how badly you're being lied to by the media and people like Al Gore. We'll start with carbon dioxide. Climate alarmists and the media are trying to convince you that current CO2 levels are approaching very, very dangerous levels. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Earth is currently experiencing one of the lowest carbon dioxide levels in its history. Over the last several hundred million years, the average CO2 level in our atmosphere was approximately 1,600 parts per million. We're only a fourth of that right now. During the Jurassic period, when dinosaurs roamed the Earth and it was vegetation from pole to pole and everything was lush and green, carbon dioxide levels were more than 5 times what they are today. To give you an idea of how insignificant the current levels of carbon dioxide are, take a look at this graph. This graph represents the Earth's atmosphere. There's 2,500 squares. The total carbon dioxide accumulation in our atmosphere is represented by the one red square, 1/2500th of the atmosphere. Now, consider the fact that man's contribution to that is only 3% of that one square, or 1/83,000th of the atmosphere. That's man's total CO2 imprint in the atmosphere. We are only talking about carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere of 400 parts per million, of which man only contributes 3%, or 12 parts per million. Is that a dangerous level? No. To give you an idea, on U.S. naval submarines, the average CO2 concentration in the air in a naval submarine is between 5,000 and 8,000 parts per million, up to 20 times more than is currently in our atmosphere. And I'm not even 100% convinced that we're even at 400 parts per million, and let me tell you why. If you look at this graph that I'm showing you right now, you'll see that for decades, the average CO2 levels went up and down and up and down and up and down, totally random. And then all of a sudden, along about 1958, everything just took this nice smooth trajectory upward at a very radical rate. And where was this atmospheric CO2 monitoring center located? On the side of a volcano. What could possibly go wrong there? I know what you're thinking. What happens during those periods when the volcano is emitting excessively high levels of carbon dioxide? Well, they've got a mathematical equation for that. And who is better with mathematical equations than our government? The last thing I want to mention about carbon dioxide is how it's created. The primary creation of carbon dioxide comes from the oceans. When the atmosphere around the oceans warm the oceans release carbon dioxide. When the atmosphere around the oceans cool, the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. So with that in mind, in order for the oceans to warm, the atmosphere has to be warm, and that warming of the ocean releases carbon dioxide. So in other words, carbon dioxide is a product of global warming. It's not a cause of global warming. Think about that. Now let's talk about extreme weather. The media today covers every weather event as if it's the biggest, baddest, worst event of its kind ever. And I'm speaking specifically of the big 5: hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires, and floods. So let's look at each of these individually and see just how bad they have really been in the last few years. Let's start with floods. There will always be floods. And despite the fact that there have been a couple rather large floods in recent years, that's not unusual. There's big floods all the time. In fact, the 10 largest floods in world history all happened before 1976. If you look at wildfires over the last 10 years, in the period between 2007 and 2009 through August 19th of those respective years, there was an average of more than 62,000 wildfires per year. Moving this direction, in the last 6 years, there have been an average of 38,886 through that same date, a reduction of 38% in the last 6 years. Drought activity hasn't gotten any worse. The only thing that's gotten worse is the media coverage. There is always a drought happening somewhere, and there's always record precipitation happening somewhere. That's how Mother Nature works. A few years ago, it happened in Oklahoma and Texas. We were told that because of the global warming phenomenon that their drought was never going to end. And what happened? They got record precipitation. The same thing happened in California recently. We were told that California had a drought that would never end because of global warming. And what happened this last winter and spring? They got record precipitation. That's the way Mother Nature works. And that's the way it'll always work. And what about hurricanes? Our media's told us that our hurricanes are getting much more prolific and much more severe. No, they're not. This graph shows that there's been a 40-year downward trend in global hurricane activity. Recently, 2 severe hurricanes hit the U.S. coastline, Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Hurricane Irma in Florida. Despite the fact that both of these were Category 4 or higher hurricanes, they were the first Category 3 or higher hurricanes to hit the U.S. coastline since Hurricane Wilma in 2005. That was the longest stretch without a Category 3 hurricane since the mid-1800s. Generally speaking, we're in a relatively mild period as far as hurricanes go. In fact, since 1970, Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma were only the 4th and 5th Category 4 or higher hurricanes to make U.S. landfall. So that's a total of 5 since 1970. In the 43 years prior to that, there were a total of 14 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes that made U.S. landfall. Both Hurricane Harvey and Irma were devastating. But when it comes to fatalities, we were lucky. Hurricane Harvey, as of this taping, was responsible for 82 deaths. Hurricane Irma is responsible so far for 69 deaths. And I'm sure that number will climb a bit. But in the scheme of things, neither of these would even rank in the top 50 with regard to fatalities when it comes to hurricanes that hit U.S. landfall. Hurricane Harvey would not have had anywhere near the deaths that it had it not stalled over the Houston area, which is unusual for a hurricane. Generally, when they stall out over the ocean. They drop the same amount of rain or more, but it's out over the ocean. Nobody sees it, nobody cares, because it's not affecting anybody on landfall. The thing that made Harvey different was the fact that it stalled over the Houston area, dropping up to 51 inches of rain in different parts of the Houston area. That's what caused the majority of the fatalities and the majority of the property damage. It's rare, but it's not unheard of. In fact, in 1963, Hurricane Flora stalled out over Cuba, and in some towns dropped as much as 100 inches of rain and killed over 1,750 people in Cuba. So, does it happen? Yes, it's rare, but it happens. Is it because of global warming? No. It's just how Mother Nature works. Wherever it stalls, it's going to cause damage if it's over landfall. One thing that we have to be aware of moving forward is that the mainstream media is going to use every opportunity they can to promote a global warming narrative. And as such, they're going to take catastrophes, hurricanes like Harvey and Irma, and certain tornadoes and certain windstorms and certain other natural disasters and blame it on global warming or climate change, but they're going to cherry pick their information, and we have to be very careful of that. One thing that you'll find that they do quite often is they'll refer to, for example, Hurricane Irma. The wind speeds in Hurricane Irma, they said, were the highest on record, 185 degrees out in the Atlantic. Well, you have to ask yourself, how long have we had the equipment to even measure wind speeds out in the Atlantic? The answer is not very long. When you talk about things like satellite imagery, you're only talking about sophistication that goes back into the 1970s. Before that, at the time of, say, the Galveston hurricane that killed over 8,000 people, did we know what that wind speed was when it was out in the Gulf? No, we didn't. Not with any degree of certainty, obviously, but
So you have to be very careful, because the media is going to make it sound like in all recorded history, this is the worst thing that's ever happened, when in reality, they're talking about a block of time that's only several decades old. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that when the media is talking about property damage and record property damage from different storms, it's basically apples to oranges, because there is so much more of value now, especially around the coastal areas, than there was back in the day, that you can't compare the monetary losses, the property losses versus back then, with any kind of an apples to apples comparison. The stuff now is just worth so much more that is there. The one thing that you can compare, to some degree, although people now have better warning capabilities and so forth, but one thing that you can compare to some degree is fatalities. And if you look at the fatalities with regard to Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Irma, if you go back just in the Atlantic storms alone, the Atlantic hurricanes, like I said, Irma and Harvey don't even make the top 50. If you look here at the top 31, number 31, you still have 1,300 fatalities. So obviously, if you're less than 100, you're not even going to be anywhere in the ballpark. Look, there have been hundreds of hurricanes in the past, and there will be hundreds of hurricanes in the future. I find it ironic that Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma are the first two that are the result of global warming. What caused the rest of them? When it comes to hurricanes, through all of my research, I have come to realize and believe firmly in two things. One, man does not cause hurricanes. Two, hurricanes do cause irresponsible journalism. Tornado activity has also been very calm. This graph from the NOAA shows an almost 60-year downward trend in frequency of strong tornadoes. And here in the U.S., in 2011, there were 553 deaths by tornadoes in 2011. Last year, there was 18. Contrary to what the media has tried to tell us, neither the U.S. nor the rest of the world has been experiencing extreme weather conditions. If you look at this chart, you'll see that losses from weather-related events as a percentage of GDP worldwide have actually dropped significantly since 1990. One of the biggest lies that you're being told is that man-made global warming is causing an excessive amount of melting at the polar ice caps. That simply isn't true. The Earth's ice have been melting for over 18,000 years, ever since the end of the last ice age. What we're seeing right now is actually the least amount of ice melt and the least amount of sea level rise in that 18,000 years. First, let me talk about the polar ice melt, and then I'll segue that into how that is impacting the global sea level rise. Let's start with Antarctica. There have been a number of stories recently with regard to ice melting in Antarctica. Here's an example of a couple of them. And those stories, of course, are trying to further the narrative that Antarctica is actually getting warmer and that the ice is melting. Here's a few stories, for example, that were written by CBS, USA Today, and Reuters. All of these headlines imply that Antarctica as a whole is hitting record high temperature. Once again, nothing could be further from the truth. Most of these news outlets mention the fact that this temperature was recorded at an Argentinian base called Esperanza. But that's where they leave it. And they're probably praying to God that you don't do your homework and find out exactly where Esperanza is. As it turns out, Esperanza is located at the far western edge of Antarctica, about as far from the South Pole as you can get. And it's located at sea level. This is on a continent that has an average elevation of 8,200 feet. The majority of Antarctica is a higher elevation portion called the Antarctic Plateau. The Antarctic Plateau has never been above 19.4 degrees. And it didn't get to 19.4 degrees until 1980, and it's never been above that since. The average temperature in Antarctica is 56 degrees below zero. Not the coldest temperature, the average temperature is 56 below zero. Think about that. As a matter of fact, the coldest temperature ever recorded in history was recorded in 2010 in Antarctica at 135.8 degrees below zero. 3 years later, it almost broke that record again, hitting 135.3 below zero. That doesn't sound like global warming. Here's another ploy that the media uses to deceive you. If you look at this portion of the clip that I took out of this article from early 2017, the reporter shows that the lowest temperature ever recorded was 128.6, set in 1983. Keep in mind, this story was written in 2017, so this reporter knew full well that there was at least 2 instances of that record being broken, yet it was not put in her article, for obvious reasons. They wanted to keep the narrative alive that global warming has continued to increase over the last few decades. That's the new media norm. If facts get in the way of your narrative, you just eliminate the facts. Despite all the global warming hysteria and predictions of apocalyptic Antarctic ice melt, Antarctica has continued to set ice coverage records in 3 out of the last 5 years. Here is an article from The Guardian that I think captures the essence of the media's problem. It is written by a guy by the name of Carl Mathiasson, and it's entitled, "Why is Antarctic Sea Ice at Record Levels Despite Global Warming?" I love the part where it says, "Antarctic levels are confounding the world's most trusted climate models." Hey Carl, I think I found your problem. You're trusting climate models. There hasn't been a climate model yet that has been correct. Perhaps you should do some independent research. Now let's look at Greenland, where we've really got a problem. Oh my God. Greenland has lost 9 trillion tons of ice in the last century, and it's continuing to lose ice. But I'm not sure what the percentage is. Nobody put the percentage down there. So let's do the math. First, let's convert tons to metric tons. Then we'll convert metric tons to gigatons. A gigaton equals about 1 cubic kilometer, approximately. So now we end up with 8,165 cubic kilometers of ice, which roughly equates to a cube of ice that is about 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers, which is a damn big cube of ice. However, Greenland has almost 1.7 million square kilometers of ice, which means when we cut through all the smoke and mirrors, Greenland has actually only lost 0.3% of its ice in a century. That doesn't seem very significant to me. And keep in mind that a couple of the stories I read actually indicate that that's not 100 years, that's in 115 years. So in 115 years, Greenland, which is coming off of an ice age and has been melting for 18,000 years, which you would expect to be losing maybe, 2, 3, 4% of its ice a year with this catastrophic global warming that they're talking about. Yet in 115 years, it has lost a total of 0.3% of its ice. 0.3%. Not much melting going on there, folks. And how much has that massive amount of ice melt contributed to sea level rise? Well, you remember the old saying about rubbing 2 nickels together? Well, the next time you rub 2 nickels together, take a look at those 2 nickels, because those 2 nickels represent approximately 0.39 centimeters which is exactly what the sea level rise was as a result of Greenland ice melt between 1993 and 2010, a 17-year stretch, and all that the Greenland ice melt contributed to global sea level rise was 0.39 of a centimeter. So now let's take a look at the Arctic ice as a whole. This is very important because the Arctic ice, or loss of Arctic ice that's being claimed, offsets what we know is happening in Antarctica, where ice is actually growing down there and has set record ice coverage in 3 of the last 5 years. So what we're being told is the Arctic ice is melting at a rate that far exceeds what's happening in Antarctica. So one of the first things that the media looks at is what the ice minimums are during the summer months, and particularly in August. The August numbers have just come in, and for August of 2017, it turned out that the minimum was the third lowest in their recorded history, which, once again, the recorded history only goes back to 1979, so you're only looking at a 38-year window. So August of 2017 was the lowest in that 38-year period. Now, how it stacks up to the lowest, which was in 2012, it still had 800,000 square kilometers of ice more than there was in August of 2012. So that's a pretty huge difference with regard to ice coverage in an era where we're told that the ice is going to continue to melt. So I think it's significant to note that once again, we were only the third lowest in 38 years, and that it was still 800,000 square kilometers above the lowest in that 38-year period, which is still pretty significant. One thing that I think needs to be pointed out is when you're dealing with the Arctic versus Antarctica, Antarctica has an average elevation of 8,200 feet. Obviously, the Arctic is much lower to sea level, so you're going to have a lot more temperature variances and a lot more temperature impact and precipitation impact that is going to determine what kind of ice coverage and snow coverage that you have on a year-to-year basis. Far more impact by precipitation actually than temperature. And so we also need to take into account this, once again, when people talk about the coverage of ice and snow in the Arctic, they're relying on satellite imagery that's only been available since 1979. So we have to keep that in the back of our mind, because we know in history there's been a lot of, there's evidence of a lot more periods when there was far less ice than there is now. And so that's going to tend to be cyclical up there. So despite what the doom and gloom that they're trying to tell you, this is just part of a natural cycle. And what you're going to see is at some point, you're going to see a lot more ice coverage, snow coverage in the Arctic moving forward at different times, and you're going to see periods with less ice at different times. Last September, for example, they had the highest accumulated ice for a September on record. Once again, the record was only since 1979, so you can't really judge by that. But they did have the highest September. Now, they had an October and November that were lacking because of that. But that's just the way it works. You know, everything's not going to go the exact same every year. So this is Mother Nature we're talking about. It's unpredictable. First, I want to show you this image of satellite image of the Arctic taken on March 7th of this year. As you can see, there is no shortage of ice out there as of March 7th, which you wouldn't have, because that's, coming out of the winter, so that's when you're going to have one of your maximums of your coverage. But obviously there's a huge coverage. It's not devoid of ice. So that's one thing. If you look at this next chart, you'll see that the ice thickness actually grew from 2010 to 2013, and actually between 2012 and 2013, the ice actually grew by 533,000 square miles in the Arctic. Let me repeat that. Between 2012 and 2013, the ice coverage actually grew by 533,000 square miles. This is in a time when we were told that we were going to be losing ice. I mentioned earlier that satellite imagery and satellite data only went back to 1979. But did it actually go back further than that, and we weren't made aware of it? During my research on the Arctic, I came across a report which summarized the analysis of several extensive independent studies of Arctic sea ice, and a couple of things in that report caught my eye. The first thing that caught my eye was this sentence. It must be recognized, though, that sea ice is strongly influenced by surface winds and ocean currents, so that the consequences of global warming for changes in sea ice extent and thickness are unlikely to be straightforward. Yeah, it seems like climate alarmism and straightforwardness have never gone hand in hand. Then came two statements which may forever change the way you look at Arctic ice melt. The first was this. Especially important, satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. That was followed by this statement. Since about 1976, the aerial extent of sea ice in the Northern Hemisphere has varied about a constant climatological level, but in 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. If satellite data goes all the way back to the early 1970s, why are we being told that satellite data only goes back to 1979? Well, in 1979, sea ice in the Arctic was reported to be at its greatest extent since the 1920s. So using 1979's ice coverage as your benchmark is very misleading, because not only has the 38 years since 1979 been below the 1979 levels, but it's likely that the 50 years before 1979 were also below 1979 levels. So what would happen if we were able to obtain that data going back to 1972 and show that period from 1972 through 1975, which had significantly less ice coverage, and add that into the equation? I think you would find that what we're seeing right now would easily fall within natural historic variances. If that is the case, then the entire apocalyptic Arctic ice melt story will be blown to pieces. So at this point, a lot of people are asking, well, if in fact the polar ice caps are melting at a historically normal level, why then are we being told that there's a dramatic sea level rise occurring right now that could impact our coastal cities and coastal areas with as much as a 6-meter rise over the course of just several decades? The answer is, it's BS. As I've stated before, sea level rise has been occurring for the last 18,000 years, since the end of the last ice age. And over the last several thousand years, it's gotten to a point where it's almost negligible. As you can see from the graph in this picture, it has almost flatlined at a rate of only about 1.5 millimeters per year. That's our current level of sea level rise, is about 1.5 millimeters per year. To give you an idea of what that looks like, that is roughly the thickness of a penny. That much every year. So it would take 100 years, a full century, to even rise 6 inches. At current levels, a sea level rise of 6 meters would take almost 4,000 years. What's really sad is the mainstream media continues to print that garbage. They listen to people like Al Gore as if he's God, as if he knows everything about climate change that there is to know, when in reality, he may know it, but he's not telling you the truth. He's trying to create a narrative, and he's trying to make an awful lot of money based on that narrative. And despite the fact that Al Gore has yet to be right, the mainstream media follows every word he says and prints every word he says as if it's gospel. And he's become so desperate, he's almost to the point of delusional. And if you think I'm joking, listen to this next clip.
Unfortunately and regrettably, a lot of serious damage has been done. Greenland, for example, is losing 1 cubic kilometer of ice every single day. I went down to Miami and saw fish from the ocean swimming in the streets on a sunny day.
I rest my case. That, my friends, is the mainstream media's expert. And if stories about catastrophic polar ice melt and rising sea levels wasn't enough to scare you, Al Gore and the mainstream media decided to tug at your heartstrings. So they told you that the poor polar bears up in the Arctic were nearing extinction and that their environment was being slowly taken away and that the population was slowly dying out. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the early 1960s, the polar bear population in the Arctic was about 5,000. Today, it is estimated to be over 30,000. Enough so that polar bears are actually becoming a nuisance in the Arctic. In fact, it is my understanding that U.S. and Canadian wildlife officials have not been able to meet the demands of the polar bears for a slight increase in Coca-Cola. Okay, so I'm kidding about the Coke, all right? Polar bears like a nice Merlot. But seriously, folks, don't worry about the polar bears. They're doing just fine. Okay, so now let's talk about global warming. Or is there any global warming? As I mentioned before, if there is any global warming, if there is any climate change, man has actually no impact on either weather-related issues, warming, storms, anything. Our footprint, man's carbon footprint, is only 1/83,000th of the atmosphere, which we've stated before. So if there is any global warming, then man has absolutely nothing, no control over that. However, is there even any real global warming? To answer that question, one has to look at the data being given and the reliability of that data. Climate alarmists try to tell us that today's temperatures are the hottest that they've ever been, at least in the last 150 years. But how do they know that? How reliable is that data from, say, 150 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 70 years ago? The truth is, it's not that reliable, and here's why. Let's start with the basics. Back in the 1800s, early 1900s, the only way you had to measure temperature was either with an alcohol thermometer or a mercury thermometer. You didn't have the satellites, you didn't have the abundance of weather stations, you didn't have any way to really record atmospheric temperatures. So those back in the day was very primitive, which leads to a lot of other questions. First of all, as far as when you're using an alcohol thermometer versus a mercury thermometer, there's some variables there. One is they read differently. An alcohol thermometer has a concave reading in it, so you could be off, depending on what angle you're looking at it, you could be off as much as 1 to 2 degrees, just depending on the angle that you're looking at it from. A mercury thermometer has a convex top on it. The same thing, depending on where what angle you're looking at it from, you could be as much as 1 or 2 degrees off. Then you have the question of, were they properly calibrated? Were they properly maintained? Were they being used in the proper environments? In other words, an alcohol thermometer is really good in a colder environment because the freezing point's less. Mercury thermometer is a lot better in a hotter environment. So were they being used properly in the proper environments, or were they limited because of that time and availability? Were they limited to maybe one thermostat or one thermometer over another? So there's a lot of questions there as to the reliability of those readings
that were coming from those areas back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and so forth. Yet those that are trying to promote the global warming narrative try to convince us that they have reliable numbers going all the way back into the 1800s. Take a look at this image that NASA and the NOAA recently put out to help forward the notion of that the recent years have been the hottest in history. Now, when you look at this image, that's incredible detail. That is incredible amount of knowledge in there for being a period from 1883 to 1887. Keep in mind that NASA wasn't founded until 1958. So I'm not quite sure where they're getting their data, but they have made an awfully detailed map, including areas like the Amazon and Africa and the South Pole and the North Pole with regard to temperature readings and temperature readings out in the oceans, which they didn't have that capability in 1883. So this is all speculative on this image. And since I'm talking about the NOAA, it should be noted that they have been caught manipulating temperature data in an effort to make it appear that global temperatures have been increasing at a higher rate than they actually have been. Here's an example. If you look at this graph from a few years ago, you'll see that what they reported and what they actually measured were two different things. What they reported showed an increase in temperature readings as opposed to the actual. There was actually a slight decrease in the average temperature readings. When somebody actually calls them on their misrepresentation, if you will, then you end up with headlines like this where, for example, in 2014, they said that was the hottest year on record. But when they were actually called on it and confronted with the evidence, they said, well, we are 38% certain that it was the hottest year on record, which I guess is another way of saying that they were 62% certain that it wasn't. So your next question ought to be, how does the NOAA manipulate their temperature figures? Well, there's a little thing called the urban heat island effect. And let me explain the urban heat island effect to you. The urban heat island effect is when you have a weather station that is located in, let's say, a city where it's surrounded by, asphalt, glass, metal, that kind of things that retain heat longer than the natural environment would. Now, our natural environment, be it the ocean, be it the mountains and that, represent basically 99% of the earth. So those are the places that have been unencumbered by, building, by construction. So if you choose to place a weather station in an area that has the concrete and the glass and the metal, then that's going to retain heat further into the evening, in particular on hot days. And so your readings from your temperature in those areas are going to be much hotter than they really are, because the metal is going to and the concrete and the asphalt is going to retain that heat a lot better than say the dirt or the grass or the oceans or something like that would in a natural environment. So you're basically skewing those temperature readings high because of that heat retention and magnification. Most reputable weather reporting agencies would never choose to put their weather reporting stations in an urban heat island type environment. Yet the NOAA, out of 1,218 weather stations that they have in the U.S., have 808 of those that are located in areas that would be considered urban heat islands, and as such would be reporting compromised information. So the NOAA is left to do one of two things. Either they report those unrealistically high temperatures as being factual, or they adjust them, or as they say in the business, they homogenize them. Either way, you're going to be left with figures that could conceivably be extremely inaccurate, either on purpose or by accident. So why then would the NOAA not choose to relocate those 808 weather stations that are in urban heat island areas, or simply go to maybe using a balance of lower atmospheric satellite readings, which are far more accurate and don't have to be adjusted? Maybe it's because those lower atmospheric satellites, that data has shown that there has been no warming in over 2 decades. Would that be the reason why it's not being used? I don't know. What I do know is that based on its data collection sources and its propensity to manipulate that data, the NOAA, in my opinion, has lost the bulk of its credibility. In short, it does not appear that there has been any global warming in at least the last 2 decades, at least none that can be proven with dependable evidence that hasn't been compromised. Finally, I want to talk about the supposed 97% consensus on man-made global warming. There is no 97% consensus on man-made global warming. There is no survey that backs that up. There is no poll that backs that up. There are several theories as to how it might have come about, and I will explain the 2 that are the most common and what actually became of them. The most commonly cited origin of the 97% consensus seems to have come from a study that was done in Australia by a gentleman by the name of John Cook. In that study, Cook went through 11,944 abstracts, and of those 11,944 abstracts, 4,014 of those were said to have expressed an opinion, and of those 4,014, Cook indicated that 97.1% of those agreed with the concept of man-made global warming. It is uncertain why 66% of those abstracts were ignored. However, a team from the University of Delaware later went on and reviewed those same 11,944 abstracts and went through every one of them, and what they found was out of all of those 11,944 abstracts, only 41 actually agreed with the theory of man-made global warming. 41, which is 0.3%, or of those actually expressing an opinion, basically 1%. That's it. That is not a consensus. It should also be noted that Cook has never allowed anyone to review his notes on that research. The second potential source of that claim likely came from an IPCC survey in which 77 out of 79 scientists stated that they agreed with the theory of man-made global warming. Now, there were hundreds, literally hundreds of scientists that abstained from giving an opinion because, as it turned out, they did not agree with that synopsis. However, under that environment, if you openly defied the theory of man-made global warming, you likely would lose research funding. So most of these scientists, rather than risk losing their funding, they just chose not to express an opinion. Now let me contrast that. In 1992, more than 4,000 scientists from 106 countries, 72 of which were Nobel Prize winners, came forward and signed a petition informing the world that the current narrative being put out by the politicians about man-made global warming was a false narrative. That's over 4,000 people from 106 countries with 72 Nobel Prize winners. That's just one instance. 5 years later, a similar petition was signed by more than 15,000 scientists most with advanced degrees, which stated that the theory of man-made global warming was based on flawed ideas and was contrary to their research. In 2010, Mark Morano, the founder of ClimateDepot.com, also released a list of more than 1,000 scientists who also disagreed with the theory of man-made global warming. In 2014, Patrick Moore, the founder of Greenpeace, made the following statement: "There is no scientific proof that human emissions of carbon dioxide are the dominant cause of the minor warming of the Earth's atmosphere over the past 100 years. That's from the founder of Greenpeace. 3 years ago, when my book Spin Game came out, I made a challenge to all of those people who were hitting me with the argument of the 97% consensus. And I made them a bet that for every name of a scientist that they could bring me who agreed with man-made global warming, I would give them 10 names of scientists who did not agree with global warming. As of this date, no one has accepted my challenge." Folks, what I presented to you today is just a fraction of the mountain of evidence that debunks the theory of man-made global warming. Regardless of what our weather or our climate does, man has nothing to do with it, never has and never will. We're too insignificant, and we would be very, ignorant to think that we actually would have that kind of power to influence what Mother Nature does. So please rest easy. Wake up tomorrow like you woke up every morning and enjoy the world. It's out there to be enjoyed. We're not going to die in the next 20 or 50 or 100 or 1,000 years. The world's still going to be around. We still have to be good stewards of our land. We still should not litter. We should not dump hazardous materials. We should not burn during an inversion. I mean, all the things that are common sense. Those things we still need to be able to do. And there will come a time when we will be able to use alternative sources of energy and power because it will become affordable and dependable. But that time isn't now. But it's getting here, and we will get there, and we'll all be happy to use it when that time comes. But until then, don't beat yourself up trying to save a world that doesn't need to be saved. If you haven't already done so, please go to Amazon.com and check out a copy of my book, Spin Game, Exposing Political Lies and Tactics. In that book, I expose 9 political subjects and the truth about each one of them. I think you'll find it a good read. You'll find more about climate change as well as 8 other topics that are very hot-button topics and pertinent to our time. Once again, that is Spin Game, Exposing Political Lies and Tactics. One thing I said at the start of the show was that I do a lot of things such as poetry and writing and lyrics and that, and we're getting close to Veterans Day, and I hold veterans near and dear to my heart, and so I recently wrote a song for veterans, and we're getting close enough that I would like to go ahead and close out the show with a song that I wrote for veterans. So to all of you veterans and all of you, God bless you, and we'll see you again on the next show. Thank you.
He gently held a purple heart and brushed away the tears. A folded flag he hadn't touched in almost 40 years. Images that billow from a dark and distant time. The memory of a fallen brother lost before his prime. A brother who died fighting for this country in the name of freedom. We stand forever in your debt. We honor you and swear to God we never will forget the unsung heroes who left their home and family. With all of those who gave their life to keep this country free. forget the sacrifice you made in the name of freedom. Every day a few more heroes ushered to their grave, covered by the stars and stripes they fought so hard to save. As glory flies against the sky, our hands held to our chest, a silent benediction for the souls we've laid to rest. For some of those who made it home, the struggle's never gone. A world defined by clouded minds, where conflict lingers on. Some with bodies compromised, but minds as strong as steel, with hearts as big as Texas that their toughness can't conceal. The selflessness and bravery that you've shown in the name of freedom, we stand forever in your debt. We pray for you and swear to God we never will forget the unsung heroes who left their home and family, and all of those who gave their life to keep this country free. We won't forget the sacrifice you made in the name of freedom. To all of you who took that oath, for those who proudly served, we gratefully extend to you the thanks that you deserve. You kept us free and proved to be the best there's ever been. And I believe if we needed you, you'd do it all again. In the name of freedom, we stand forever in your debt. And if I live 1,000 years, I never will forget the unsung heroes who left their home and family, and all of those who gave their lives to keep this country free. We won't forget the sacrifice you made in the name of freedom. Oh, in the name of freedom, yeah, in the name of freedom.